Hello and welcome to the course for American History. Because this is a course that is modeled after the Florida requirements for American history, we're going to be starting this course off with looking at some of the events and things like that that led to the Civil War, going through a little bit, looking at the social factor of the Civil War, and then ending this unit with a look at American Reconstruction. So what we're going to be looking at today is the concept of slavery, states' rights, and Western expansion. At the end of this lesson, students will be able to review the causes and consequences of the Civil War and identify the characteristics that define and differentiate regions. Some of the terms that you should know more about after this presentation are the Wilmot Proviso, the Free Soil Party, popular sovereignty, secede, Compromise of 1850, and the Fugitive Slave Act. Here's a document from the DBQ project, and what I'd like for you to do here is this is a good opportunity to practice our sourcing skills. So using the document analysis sheet that we've used in class, please go through and practice the sourcing skill. This would be a good time to pause the video so that you can be able to do that. So, the information that you should have been able to pull out of this when it comes to the idea of sourcing is we should have been able to see that the title of the document is North of Slavery, which is going to give us the idea that everything that they're talking about here is north of the Mason-Dixon line, and provides us with an opportunity to read a little bit more into the types of areas that we'll be focusing on within that document. When we look at the date of the document, we see that it was published in the University of Chicago Press in 1961. So we've got an idea that this is from a secondary source, or at least it was published in a secondary source. But when we look up at who the author is, Leon Litwack, we also can see that he was a Civil War historian that focused on slavery. So when we see the numbers were put together in 1860, we know that numbers and stuff like that are coming from a primary source. And then we know Leon Litwack, like I just said, is an individual who was a Civil War historian who focused on slavery. So, looking at the concepts of what's going on within the system, is we have to be able to see how slavery divides the nation. So, when we look at the difference between northern and southern ways of life, in the north, we have a very industrial society that is largely led by European immigration. So we've got cities, we've got factories, we've got a very urban way of life that takes place. Now the South is very different from this. The South is a very agrarian society that's focused on farming. We have a society that is largely predicated on the use of slavery in order to be able to keep farms and plantations and things like that profitable. So when we look at where the United States stands going into the Civil War, we see two very, very different societies that view the world in very different ways. These regional differences really do help pave the way for many of the issues that are fought about during the Civil War. One of the key questions that existed with the expansion of the United States is, should the United States allow for slavery's expansion into the West? And this is a very, very hot button, very hotly contested and debated subject that really is fought over a very long period of time. And really, when you look at it from the very inception of American history, when we see the Three-Fifths Compromise and how it is determined that an African American is going to count for 3/5 of a person for representation, when we look at this constant debate over states' rights with the 10th Amendment, which states that any power not guaranteed to the federal government is guaranteed to the states, that we look at what was included in the Articles of Confederation, we see a system and a society that is very, very divided in the things that are going on. So the Wilmot Proviso, which is a plan that looks at how we should proceed with slavery in the United States, asks for slavery and involuntary servitude to be banned in any lands won from Mexico during the Mexican-American War. And we can look at that concept by looking at this map. So we can see what was free at the time, we can look at what was a slave state at the time, and we can look at that land that exists out to the west that was won under the Wilmot Proviso, and this is the proposed area that slavery be prohibited from. So we see a huge chunk of the United States. Now, of course, this is going to make the southern states very, very nervous because they are going to want to see a continuation of the type of lifestyle that they live, because if they do not have that continuation, the fear is that as more and more free states enter the Union, and the more and more they are outnumbered, the more likely that their way of life is to be attacked. And we also can see on this map here where the Missouri Compromise would have taken place with the 3630 parallel. And this was supposed to be that any land that was admitted into the Union, anything north of that 3630 line, was supposed to be a free state, and anything that was to the south of that line was supposed to be admitted as a slave state. So we see the type of impact that the Wilmot Proviso was supposed to have within this society. Southerners very strongly opposed the measure, and it failed in the democratically dominated Senate. Because what we have to realize is during this time period, and it's something that's very opposite of what we're used to today, is that the Republican Party existed within the North. And at this point, the Republican Party doesn't really exist at this point, some of the basic concepts. But the Republican Party, the Whigs, other things like that would have been much more of a Northern party, where the Democrats are very much exist within the South. So fighting to end slavery. Many political parties were created to fight the expansion of slavery. The Free Soil Party, which was a huge supporter of the Wilmot Proviso, pledged to resist the power of slavery and pledged to push for freedom for all. They believed in free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. So this was a party that very much went out of their way to try and push for policies within the United States that would lead to freedom for all. But when we look at the issue of slavery within the United States, this is a topic that many people tried to avoid, as to not alienate the voters that already existed within the country and to make sure that they continued to be politically viable, because this is a very it's a very caustic issue. It is something to where if you take a huge stand on one side or the other, it brought you a lot of enemies. So one of the ways that these parties within the United States tried to skirt the issue was to do the idea of popular sovereignty. And this was a huge idea with the Democrats and the Whigs. And they like this idea of popular sovereignty, or the idea that as each state enters the Union, that they should have the ability, that the people within those states should have the ability to be able to vote to determine whether or not that state should be a free state or whether it should be a slave state. This means that the people, not Congress, should decide these types of issues. And this was a way of, rather than taking a stance on the issue and making it known what your own personal belief on the issue was, this was a way of kind of pushing the issue away from you and not really needing to take a stance, which once again was very politically dangerous. So California ends up playing a huge role within this whole controversy as well. Because in 1848, there's a major gold rush that begins to take place in California. And this causes some issues because California is very much the Wild West at this point. And a lot of the things that would have been illegal in the rest of the country are not illegal in California at this point. So in order to try and protect themselves, the residents of California in 1849 draft their own constitution, and they ask to be admitted into the Union as a free, non-slave state. Now, this caused widespread controversy, as it would have put more free states in the Union than slave states. And this is something that you don't want to see the balance, get upset, especially if you're on that southern side of things, or really on either side of things, because you don't want your side to lose out. So in order to try and resolve this issue, Henry Clay offered up a compromise known as the Compromise of 1850. That Compromise of 1850 set a very strict line as far as where slave states and where free states would be admitted into the Union. And anything north of that line would be considered to be a free state, and anything south of that line would be a slave state. So when we look at that, Clay's Compromise of 1850, it called for California to be admitted as a free state, it called for New Mexico and Utah to decide that matter based upon the idea of popular sovereignty. It would allow for the slave trade within Washington, D.C. to end, and Texas would give up claims to New Mexico in return for $10 million. And we can see this in the map for the Compromise of 1850 as far as how this would have actually worked. So we see the slave states in yellow, we see the free states in green, and then we see the states that would have been open to popular sovereignty based upon that purple concept. Many Southerners felt that too much power would lie in the hands in the North with this plan. So, in order to try and sweeten the pot on this, many felt that stronger fugitive slave laws were necessary. Southerners argued that if fugitive slaves' protections weren't included in a compromise, the South should be able to secede or break away from the Union. So here we are in 1850, and we're starting to see the seeds of the Civil War pop into place here. We've got already states starting to use that idea of threatening to secede or break away from the Union based upon this idea of slavery. That is why when you look at the concept that of states' rights being a major issue within the Civil War, why that is absolutely true. One of the things that we really have to take from this is that states' right concept, as argued based upon the states, is the ability to be able to own slaves. So this concept of passage, by September of 1850, after great struggle, each portion of Clay's compromise had been passed as individual legislation. They weren't able to pass it as a complete package, but they were able to break it up into pieces and get it through Congress a little bit at a time. A new Fugitive Slave Act added strong amendments to earlier law, including the requirement that private citizens assist with apprehending runaway slaves, meaning that if a runaway slave was in your area, they could actually force you to be able to go through and find those slaves. Those who aided runaway slaves would be fined or imprisoned. So let's check our understanding at this point. Using the learning goals that you saw at the very beginning of the lesson, there are a few questions that you should be able to go back through and answer now that you've watched this presentation. 1. How did the events listed in this presentation lead to the fighting of the Civil War? And 2. Using evidence from this presentation, how did much of the legislation passed prior to the Civil War show the regional differences that existed in the United States?